Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us. Today, we are going to have the interdisciplinary and the advancement of research on adolescence as a part of SRA webinar series for this month, February. So we are going to have one moderator, Dr. Robert Krasner, and for awesome panelists who are going to share their stories about their interdisciplinary research on adolescence, as well as how to deal with the current situational issues, including but not limited to the pandemic, and then the social justice issues based on research. So yeah, I'm Hemin Han at the University of Alabama, who is the co-chair of the SRA Interdisciplinary Committee, co-chairing the committee with Jen Doty at University of Florida. Unfortunately, she was not able to join us because of her teaching duty, but I'm gonna chair the current session. Okay, before getting started, there are a couple of things that I would like to ask you to do. So first, if you could mute your microphone, then that would be ideal to improve the viewing experience for all of us. And then if you have any questions to ask, then please use the Q&A feature, not the chatting feature, so that you can post your questions on the Q&A board. So if you feel like some of the questions are interesting, then you can also upvote some interesting questions so that they can get more attention. Yeah, so, and also you can use the chat functionality to post any issues related to technical difficulties. And also you are feel free to tweet the webinar using SRA hashtags like SI webinars and interdisciplinarity. So let me move on to the introduction of the moderator for today, the Dr. Rob Krasner. The Dr. Rob Krasner was the past president of the Society for Research on Adolescence and an associate dean of liberal arts and Rappaport Centennial Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Krasner's mixed method research explores the connections among health, adolescent development, and education, and the contributions of these connections to socio-economic and immigration-related inequalities in American society. Two of his book titles are Fitting In, Standing Out, Navigating the Social Challenges of High School to Get an Education, published by Cambridge University Press, and Families Now, Diversity, Demography, and Development, published by Macmillan Worth. Currently, Dr. Krasner is co-director of the NSF Interdisciplinary Collaborative on Development in Context, trustee of the Population Reference Bureau, and AP Fellow for the College Board. So, Dr. Rob Krasner, are you ready to go?
Yeah, here I am.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists, and then we have a set of questions that we're going to go through to generate discussion. And I'll also be monitoring the Q&A panel, so I'll be able to ask questions of the panelists for the people that are listening. So our panelists, we've got a great lineup today. The first panelist is Mary Helen Imordino Yang, who's a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California and director of the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education, or CANDLE. She studies the psychological and neurobiological development of emotion and self-awareness and connections to social, cognitive, and moral development in educational settings. She uses cross-cultural interdisciplinary studies of narratives and feelings to uncover experience-dependent neural mechanisms, contributing to identity, intrinsic motivation, deep learning, and generative, creative, and abstract thought. Her work has a special focus on adolescents from low SES communities, and she involves youth from these communities as junior scientists in her work. Our second panelist is Erica Britton-Lloyd, who is an interdisciplinary community-engaged developmental scientist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Riverside. She received her PhD in Human Development and Child Studies from Tufts University, completed predoctoral research fellowship with the Birth to 20 research program at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the Prevention Research Center at Arizona State University, and 2 years as an NIH Building Interdisciplinary Careers in Women's Health Scholar. Dr. Lloyd's research within psychology, human development, and prevention science explores how intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, and identity impact health and development for youth and young adults of color, specifically in Black and Latinx communities, to inform equitable and culturally relevant practice and policy. Her research on the links between racial stress, health and development, and African-American justice-involved youth has been supported by NICHD, NIH's Office of Research on Women's Health, and the Russell Sage Foundation. Dr. Lloyd's research on youth of color in the United States and youth in South Africa has been published in Child Development Perspectives, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, Journal of Adolescent Research, and Journal of Youth and Adolescence. The third panelist is Darlene Curtis. She's the Director of Developmental Psychology at the University of Florida. She's an associate professor in developmental psychology and behavioral and cognitive neuroscience, and a member of the University of Florida Genetics Institute. Dr. Curtis's research program focuses on the antecedents and consequences of stress in health and development. Her research examines risk and protective factors impacting stress-related biobehavioral health outcomes, along with the biological mechanisms of risk via epigenomic variation and the activity of the stress-sensitive hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. And finally, our fourth and final panelist today is Andrew Fellini. He's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and the Department of Psychology at UCLA. He's also a senior scientist in the Simmel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, where he directs the Adolescent Development Lab at UCLA. His work focuses on the interaction of socio-cultural experiences and biobehavioral development during adolescence among diverse populations. Okay, my mouth is now going to have to take a break, but from saying all those fancy words describing our esteemed guest. But now I'm going to move to our very first question, and every speaker is going to address this question, and then we'll move on to some other things. So the first question is this. We know that all of you have been using interdisciplinary research methods in your projects. Please tell us how you define interdisciplinary and briefly share the ways in which your research is interdisciplinary. So let's start off. The first person on my panel is Andrew, so that's a good place for us to start. Tell us what interdisciplinary means to you, Andrew.
I think it means you just have folks working together that come from a different, training and tradition and method. And I think what it really boils down to, do they have very different theoretical conceptual background? Do they oftentimes will have different methods, and very typically will have a different level of analysis in terms of what you're examining. So I think interdisciplinary research is bringing that all together to bring to bear on the same question. And I think that's the challenge, and we'll get to that later on, because many times people are really addressing different questions, even though if they think they're addressing the same. I mean, for us, we do this in a couple of different ways, but just very briefly, we typically have collaborated with neuroscientists, cultural anthropologists, psychoneuroimmunologists to look at sort of how experiences like discrimination, sleep, and prosocial behavior might shape development, and how you might see some of those mechanisms sort of psychologically within the brain, whether you're looking at the implications of health and stress biology, inflammation. I'll just sort of stop there, but that's a quick summary of what we do.
Thanks, Andrew. Mary Helen, do you want to weigh in here?
Sure. Thank you. So building on what Andrew said, I mean, I think, interdisciplinarity is what he said. And also, I think the real focus is that you have one big problem that you're looking at, that you then are coming to from various different levels. And he's completely right. And I hope we do return to this in the conversation, that actually defining the nature of the problem is a big contribution actually to interdisciplinary research. It's not just a hurdle to it, but actually rethinking what counts as a problem worth exploring, and how that problem sits in the sort of developmental space that you're looking at around adolescence. We've studied the development of how young people make meaning out of their world, their experiences, the ways in which they construct emotional feelings and narratives around the things they've witnessed in the world and how they understand their world, and how you might think of those understanding processes, those narrative constructive processes, as something like epigenetic forces that are actually growing their brains and selves over time. So we've done longitudinal research, for example, looking at how young people react to the violence they see in their neighborhood, how they make sense out of complex stories of other teenagers around the world, and then how their own individual meaning making, as revealed by like extensive open-ended qualitative interviews, can then predict individual variability and how things like emotional experiences correspond to brain activity. So we're looking really to leverage individual variability and variation in trying to uncover the mechanisms that underlie the kinds of mental capacities and engagement that we really are interested in knowing more about. So that's just a little bit about my research.
Thank you. I know that's of great interest to a lot of the people that are a membership of this organization. So Darlene, you're third on my view, and I think that we can pose the question to you. What does interdisciplinary mean, and how do you enact it?
So for me, I think about interdisciplinary research as being able to be conducted either by interdisciplinary scientists or interdisciplinary teams. And I think so far we focused and highlighted the role of interdisciplinary teams and team science. But I believe it's also just as important to consider it in light of interdisciplinary scientists themselves and people who do get dual trained in different areas and then begin to integrate across disciplines. For me, interdisciplinary science means trying to pull the best of at least two different disciplines, be they sort of the conceptual and theoretical approaches, as well as the methodologies and analytic approaches, to sort of transcend what might be possible from one of these individual disciplines to address a research question in a new way that hopefully can push the field or the respective fields forward in terms of the way that we think about things. So in terms of the way that I integrated into my research program, I sort of span the behavioral and biological divides in some way, where my focus has really been on the impact of the environment, mostly looking at stress and trauma, but also thinking about protective factors in the environment, aspects of the family and the community that can impact risk for stress-related health conditions. But a primary concern for me is how it happens through biologic processes. And so we can make these links purely at the behavioral level, but it's also important to understand the mechanisms by which they are impacting our physiology. And so the way that we do that is by taking tissue samples, hair, blood, in some cases placenta if it's appropriate for newborns, saliva samples, different sorts of peripheral tissues, and measuring hormonal concentrations, doing genotyping, doing epigenomic analysis or gene expression, immune markers, and those sorts of things to be able to think about what are the ways in which our physiology is then related to the behavioral manifestations of those of the environmental impacts.
Thanks, Darlene. I really like the point about interdisciplinary being both the between person and a within person phenomenon. And of course, everybody here on this panel illustrates that, but it's a point that's very, that we really need to make more often. So Erica, you're last on my view, but you're first, you're first in my heart. So what do you have to say about this?
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Why did I think you were going to say that, Rob? I just knew you were going to say that I was first in your heart. So for me, interdisciplinary research, it's been really interesting for me to hear how everyone else is conceptualizing it in their own work. For me, it's really thinking about how collaboration across disciplines, we're pulling from the most innovative, interesting, relevant methods to address really complex research questions. So in my work, if we're looking at things like mental health in African-American teenagers, even if we're looking at mental health in African-American teenagers who come into contact with the justice system, you need methods and philosophical understanding beyond just the individual focus, because youth are impacted by systems, they're impacted by systems of oppression, they're impacted by social systems, historical context. And so we often need to pull information from the different disciplines and bring together, really, I think someone said, the best minds, the best methods to address that question that doesn't just operate at an individual level. It really operates at multiple levels of the system. I agree with what Darlene said in terms of thinking about how individual researchers can be trained to be interdisciplinary, which is something that I did through the Birch program, coming into contact with folks from public health, for example. And you can work in interdisciplinary teams, which is another approach that I've taken. So just one classic example of that is a project we have with the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. They bring together lots of different individuals from psychology, education, learning sciences to understand how young people of color connect with science and connect with things like healthcare careers, but we're also bringing in psychological constructs like racial ethnic identity. We're also looking at families. We're also looking at how they interface with a space like the Museum of Science and Industry. And the cool thing about that project is they bring in content advisors, like people in astronomy and people in chemistry, to weigh in on that conversation. So I agree with much of what's been said in terms of, I define interdisciplinary as bringing together all of these different methods, which does bring challenges, which I'm sure we're going to get to. But in order to address these really complex psychological, sociological questions.
Thanks. I mean, this is, being creative is a very important part of being interdisciplinary. And I think that what you just said, it really captures that creativity too, which, it's just an important ingredient. So I'm going to move to another question, and I want to remind the participants that you can use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions, and I can be your go-between between the panelist and you. The next question is whether you all have tips about getting started and sustaining interdisciplinary projects. And, Erica just mentioned challenges. What are the challenges that you face, and how do you deal with those challenges? And I'd really, I think I'm going to start with Darlene here to see what she has to say about this.
So I really do appreciate this question. And I think that the answers to this are a little bit different depending on whether you're conducting research, again, as an interdisciplinary scientist or as a member of an interdisciplinary team. So I'm going to start by focusing on the interdisciplinary scientist, which is how I define myself. And there are definitely naysayers to pursuing careers across disciplines. And I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles is to contend with that. So I'll orient this initially to sort of the early to mid-career folks, tips of sort of getting started in interdisciplinary work. Graduate school and postdoctoral training are really sort of the key times in which you can really focus and delve into a literature. And as you're developing a primary expertise in one area of science, it does present a good opportunity to develop a growing expertise in one other field. I usually advise young scientists not to get too spread out across too many fields, because then you can risk becoming a jack of all trades and master of none. But beginning to spread across two fields is a good starting point. It's something that could be explored, for example, in a qualifying exam pursued as a postdoctoral training program, and then begin to integrate them as you're an independent scientist. In terms of the barriers that individuals face as an interdisciplinary scientist, I think that they happen throughout the career, right? So there are inevitably jobs that get posted within a field and within a subfield, and people want to define you and put you in a box. And you definitely need to be demonstrating competency in the areas in which you are claiming to be an expert in. And sometimes that takes some convincing. In terms of being, transitioning from an early to mid-career person, and you've got tenure and promotion on the horizon, again, you're going to have things like external reviewers who are going to be from a discipline. Applying for federal grants, you're going to have a a particular discipline that's indicated on your vita in terms of what your degree is in. And there is definitely certain challenges that come with demonstrating that you are in fact an expert in multiple fields and have the competency to pursue those. And so there are ways in which, you need to demonstrate that in terms of your research productivity. There are definitely funding mechanisms that do exist for interdisciplinary scientists. And so you do have to go looking for those, but they do exist. And those are mechanisms and means in which one can advance an interdisciplinary science agenda. The other tip that I have for folks is to branch out in terms of where you publish. So if you want your work to be visible across different fields, to publish in respective journals that are going to be sort of touch points for individuals in the fields that you bridge, and to be able to do so in a way, depending on where you are in your career trajectory, to be able to do so in a way that balances the need for reach, but also is thoughtful about as your career progresses and how you'll be viewed as a scientist.
Thank you. Mary Helen, how do you get started and how do you get over the bumps along the way? I know you have a lot to say about this.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would start by saying why get started, right? Not all questions are best answered interdisciplinarily. Like just because this is the hottest new thing doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. There are a lot of questions that really fit squarely within a discipline, and then it makes a lot of sense to stay within that discipline. So I think from my case, and I think also the other speakers' cases around this, becoming an interdisciplinary scientist, the reason I did it is because I needed to. I could see that there was a problem under my nose that my primary field of expertise from my graduate studies, which was human development and psychology, really couldn't get at. I wanted to understand sort of how you would constrain the problem space based on the biology that undergirds it. And there really wasn't a lot of research in that around the kinds of questions that I wanted to know. So I simply had to become interdisciplinary because nobody else had been doing the work yet that I needed. I needed some answers. But this does come with a lot of dangers, right? Like you can sort of become a jack of all trades. And I think if you really want to become an interdisciplinary scientist, you have to prepare yourself kind of for the long haul and strategically, like we just heard, right? Strategically think about that you're not just focusing on an interdisciplinary field, you're actually making yourself multidisciplinary first. You need to be able to speak and write and publish in the different domains, one or two, or in my case, it's more like three, that you are actually working in. And you need to have a voice and credibility within those domains, and then also be able to integrate them into a bigger research agenda that sort of is transcending the individual domain. So it's quite a heavy lift, and it's not appropriate for all kinds of questions. So that's I guess the big thing that I would say. But if it's appropriate for your question, then it's absolutely necessary, because if you feel yourself narrowed and you really can't get at what you need, and you can't understand why things are the way they are in the questions that you're interested in, and you think other disciplines may have something to say about why that is or what that is, then you need to branch out. And the other thing I would just say is one of the real things that I've come to realize, and I don't know what the other panelists think, like I'd love it if they disagreed or agreed or what, but what I've noticed is that a lot of times becoming interdisciplinary in the space of a study or a project really means kind of stepping back and losing some of the resolution in the methods across one or more of the disciplines in which you're working. So sometimes you need to step back and not have the high levels of granularity that are expected in that discipline in order to be able to align your methods with something else. So like an example, I was studying Latinx kids and how they come to make meaning and express emotion. And then we were looking at the neural correlates of that process, right? And the reviewers who were from education field, right, we're saying, but we know, kids from Honduras, it's not the same as kids from Nicaragua. There's subtle cultural differences here you're not honoring, and then the neuroscientists are saying, well, you can't look at whole networks. You should be looking at, specific mechanisms. And it's like, we really can't align. You kind of have to step back and lose some of the cherished detail in the two places to be able to line them up, and then you can rebuild it again. That's something I've noticed.
Yeah, you got to give something up to gain something here, right? Like, you know, to grab that big picture. It's also true, you know, I think that this resonates with me. What you were saying is the idea that things that you think are really important, actually lots of people don't. And, you know, it's somewhat humbling in that sense, you know. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to another question, and it's a little bit more specific, but it's about, you know, where we are right now here in the United States and many other countries, which is that we've been encountering many social problems associated with racism and threats to democracy. Such problems are highly likely to impact adolescents' lives. How do you think interdisciplinary research can promote adolescents' positive development in this somewhat contentious environment? And, you know, Andrew, given all of your research on immigration, I think I would really like to hear your perspective on this.
That's a tough question, Rob.
We're all looking to you to the answer, Andrew. We're here to solve it, and
yeah,
so no pressure.
That's all good. I think for those particular issues that you just raised, I think that it's very important. There are two things that as I saw that question, there are two things that I thought about. One is from an interdisciplinary perspective. I think that, you know, the contributions that things like fields and thoughts like coming from critical race theory or from demography or from political science are really important, right? So for example, from political science and the impact upon youth, there are a lot of people interested in just how political discourse can actually have an effect on kids. So I think that's really important. That wasn't on the radar screen 2 years ago, or some people were trying to put it on the radar screen and they've been working hard and now it's finally, and I think that's really important. But I think at the same time, it's important for us to still, and this is what I think SRA and adolescent researchers can do, is to make sure that there's a developmental story here. And so I think when we think about racism and inequality and all of these things that we're being reminded of from a structural point of view, let's keep in mind what that means for adolescents. It does not mean the same thing as it does for a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 16-year-old. And I think if we sort of, the interdisciplinary question is, what are the core developmental needs of youth? And how are these things that you just talked about, these questions, these experiences that we've had over the last several years, well, not just last several years, they've been existing forever, but they're becoming more apparent over the last several years. How do they intersect with the developmental needs of youth? That's where the nexus of interdisciplinarity can come to the fore. And if you want to do that work, I think you need to find collaborators who are interested in those developmental questions. If they're not, it's probably not going to be an effective collaboration. And that's fine if they want to focus on structure, if they want to focus on critical race, but not necessarily what it means for youth. That's important work. But at the same time, if we want to think about youth, I think the nexus is think about the core developmental needs.
You know, that's really important because, you know, just the nature of this panel, we're all developmental scientists. So when we are talking about interdisciplinarity, we're often talking about absorbing other disciplines into what we're doing to study adolescent development. And we also should talk, you know, as Andrew just pointed out, about what we have to export to other disciplines, you know, that are interested in these political issues, but aren't necessarily thinking about developmental needs and developmental appropriateness in some of these points of discussion. So we have to remember that we have something, you know, like that we have something to export to and not just import to. So thank you. And Erica, I know you've thought a lot about these issues too, so I'd really like to have you weigh in too.
Yeah, I really appreciated what Andrew just shared in terms of thinking about the developmental question. I think for me, when I think about interdisciplinary work and how it helps us really kind of tackle these issues, it makes our work more relevant. So I've been thinking a lot about how, not just how I bring other disciplines into my work, but how my work, which tends to be pretty psychological on the individual level with consideration for context, but how I can use what I do to inform the work that they're doing. So can the justice system or people who are trying to abolish the prison industrial complex, can they use our research to inform the work that they do? Can they use our science to inform changing of laws and policies? Because when we think about what each of these, or for me, when I think about how each one of these disciplines, like the questions they're trying to tackle. In my own work, I think about like youth and families, right? At the individual level, at the family level, at the community level. But I think about things like legal studies. How do they address the problem that's related to the experiences that the youth that I'm working with are having? Or even, in public health, community psychology, I think a lot about how to address problems at a public health level or at a community level. But they can also use the work that we're doing in psychology to inform what they're doing in terms of making programs, for example, more culturally relevant, or thinking about how individuals think about these problems. So I think in psychology, the tendency is always like to focus on the individual level. And the critique of psychology is that we don't pay attention to context. And then we would say it's all about the individual psychological experience. We're not going to work on fixing the systems, but really you have to work at every single level. Unfortunately, we can't do all of that. So we can't work at every single level, but all of these levels of the system have to change in order for us to see some of the issues that we're talking about addressed, if that makes sense.
Do you ever feel, Erica and Andrew, do you ever feel like, just in thinking about interdisciplinary teams, do you feel the need to do lots of different things at once, or do you think it's sufficient, or are you comfortable with just saying, well, I'm one piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, how do you deal with that tension? I mean, this has come up multiple times already, this idea, and it gets with the team versus the individual. Like, at what point does your contribution stop and someone else has to make the contribution, especially given with what you were just saying about thinking about changing the kid versus thinking about changing the context? Like, how do you approach these subjects? Like, in terms of building projects, is it bringing other people into what you're doing, or is it trying to master these different domains?
I'll just jump in. I think that's a really great question, Rob, because it is something that I've struggled with in my own work. But something that's helpful is that I think about what I do as part of a network or a web of people that are all working on these issues. So I think the tendency for maybe scientists or academics is to focus on like my singular siloed project. Like, it's me and my research lab and my papers. But I like to think about, a colleague once told me to think about my work as a conversation with the field. And so I'm offering something to this broader conversation of people that are trying to tackle these issues. So it's not just me. But I think in terms of how I've been working more on translating our research. And some of I think the challenge that we haven't talked about is the jargon across disciplines. So I'll just throw that in there. Even if you think about psychology, and like for me, the difference between social psychology and developmental psychology and how they address things like identity is like day and night. Even outside of that specific discipline, there's a lot of language that is different across different disciplines and how they're addressing and conceptualizing these issues. So we have to come to a fundamental understanding of what these processes are. And part of that, I think, is achieved through kind of thinking about translational science. Like, how do we take what we're doing and translate that into products that policymakers can use, that people in communities can use. I like to talk to folks in community about what I do, even in my own family, because it makes it less jargony and researchy and like academic. So how do I take my work on ethnic identity and kind of explain it to my grandmother, for example? So, and that's really what, in the ideal world, like what we would do with our work, put it into the hands of people that can actually use it.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on something I think we definitely need to come back to, which is we think of interdisciplinary as a meeting of scientists. And you just mentioned that it's not just a meeting of scientists, it's bridging these other barriers too. And I think that that's really important. So I actually just put in my notes, we're going to come back to that issue in a second. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on this idea of like, at what point is there only so much you can do versus like, how do you deal with those issues?
I might just add, completely second what Erica was saying. And I think a big issue for me, something that I've really had to learn to do, and I'm still not great at it, but I actively am working on it, is to actually craft the message in a way that different groups can engage with the message, which means also you need to have enough understanding of what that group is struggling with and what they think the problem is. So it's a very deep, difficult mess, to get into, but to think about how you frame your findings differently for different audiences. There may be different ways in which you focus the work or different big points that you pull out of the work. And I've found that engaging, so I do a lot of engaging with policymakers in education, for example, and I actually got a fellowship, like there are things like this around. At that time, the Spencer Foundation had a fellowship to study something like this. So I spent a year actually focusing on building these skills, and it was hugely illuminating because I realized like a lot of stuff I did, they didn't think was important, right? Mm-hmm. And thinking about how can I make them understand why what I do really does fundamentally connect to that developmental story Andrew was talking about. It's as much about learning how to say it as it is about actually learning to do the work.
Yeah, you have to be bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, metaphorically speaking, I think, to do that. One of the questions that came up in the chat, I'm just going to go ahead and pose that to y'all now. And is Jennifer asked, can you give an example of ideas or methods or assumptions from your own training that was fundamentally challenged by working with scholars from other disciplines? Darlene, do you have any reaction to that? I bet you do.
I absolutely do. Yeah. So having my own sort of personal career trajectory sort of involved doing a PhD in child psychology and really switching gears and doing a postdoctoral program in psychiatric and human genetics. And so when you think about the orientation and the priorities that are between those two fields of being sort of, in developmental science being, as has already been mentioned, very individual focused, but also getting very granular into individual lived experiences, getting very down in the weeds of, a child and adolescent behavior and observations, and then to switch gears and to think from a population genetics standpoint. There was this huge tension for me in terms of first, as I think Mary Helen made the point, first becoming multidisciplinary, right? Mastering the two crafts and mastering the priorities and the conceptualization and the methodologies. But then the tension and in the genetics world, the sample size is key in order to find effects because genetic effects are tiny. And so to be able to merge those two is an enormous challenge of how do you figure out what is the best conceptualization and methods to pull from developmental science and from genetics to be able to think about, what is going on at the behavioral and biological, level at the same time. And that is not an easy process to undertake. And I think that's the transition from becoming multidisciplinary to becoming interdisciplinary.
Yeah, a lot of the, it's amazing how like methodological things become a flashpoint for these even more than conceptual things, right? Like each discipline seems to have its holy grail. I can say as a demographer, the sampling in a different way. The systematic sampling is very, very important to me, and precise measurement is less important to me. And then, when I get on these interdisciplinary networks where we're collecting data, this always becomes a flashpoint, right? That tension between demographers and psychologists. And there's really no way to get around it except for just to do it all, right? And sometimes you don't have enough money to do it all, right? And these are the practical things which, Darlene, you mentioned earlier. We have to think about the practical side of interdisciplinary research, not just the idealistic side too. Andrew, what do you think? Can you give me an example of like getting one of these teams makes you rethink something you thought fundamentally?
I don't know if I have an answer to that question. If I can sort of punt on that a little bit and respond to what you were just saying. I mean, I think there are two things about this. I think one is you have to be temperamentally flexible. And I think it really depends on who you're working with and not just what you're working on, right? And I think if I can sort of just capture the broader theme here is I think one needs to really be try to be as humble as you can, but at the same time, holding your ground on something that is true to you. And so I think, and what you need to have are people who are like-minded that way. And I think all of us probably on this call have been put into interdisciplinary teams that look great on paper, but have failed miserably. And I think because one or more just haven't been temperamentally right or willing to go through with this and willing to be challenged. I'll give you one, I mean, the way that we have sampled or thought about ethnicity continually gets challenged in some of the groups. And that's just part of the game. And I think early on, it's easy to be very defensive, and still we're human, so I'll be defensive sometimes, but getting challenged on what it really means if you use a certain kind of label or not is really, really important, just as one example. And I think you really need to be willing to be challenged that when you use a label, it means one thing, or if you're going to categorize your sample ethnically one way, and none of those members of the sample actually use that label to describe themselves. So that's something to think about. It doesn't mean that you can't use it, but it's made us think a lot more deeply about the use of how we're going to sample and the labels that we use. So I think I answered your question in a broad way, but then got very specific. I think one challenge really is how do we consider the labels and the categories that we use when we're sampling youth.
Andrew, maybe we could follow up on that, what you just said. And, I'm thinking in this broad umbrella of, practical challenges, and something you just said reminded me that, now if you are applying for a grant from, NIH or something, especially dealing with children or something like that, you almost have to have an interdisciplinary team, right? Like, because if you don't, you could get criticized for that. But do you think that breeds a level, I don't know the right word for this, where people just bring in, someone from psychology or someone from economics almost as window dressing? And how do we avoid, I don't know, this might be too hard of a question for you, but I'm trying to think, how do we actually avoid this sort of just window dressing and really build teams, together? And how do we think about critical mass, I guess, as you say, at what point is it truly an interdisciplinary team? You don't have to answer that per se, Andrew, but I just wonder if some of y'all could reflect on that, if anyone has any thoughts. I'm sure you've all been in the position like, oh my God, I'm going to get criticized. I need to find a clinical psychologist for this team right away. How do you get over that hump where you're actually really engaging those people?
I'll chime in. So I do think that this is a legitimate concern in terms of, especially in terms of grant writing, that it can be a concern. I think the critical piece, and I think Andrew touched upon this in a nice way, that it's finding like-minded individuals where the focus is there is a mutual interest in not just you take this piece, I'll take this piece, but there's real effort put in up front. And I think most people don't realize that it's more effort than you think it's going to be be able to begin to understand the language that someone uses in a different field, to be able to wrap your head around the methodologies, to sort of prioritize how you're going to do certain things. And that it's, and I think that becomes, I think it's the buy-in that you need to make it more than window dressing, because it may not be too difficult to slap someone on. I do think that reviewers will see right through that in terms of, when an application is put forth. Oftentimes that will be the case, that it's fairly transparent when something is just people from different fields sort of slapped together on an application versus analyzing the data in such a way where it really truly appears that it's being integrated across levels. And so I think that there is that extra work up front that has to happen when a project is being planned. And I think that's the difference between window dressing and having a real interdisciplinary team, is the work that gets put up front in the planning and the design, and not just after the fact when you sort of are picking apart the data that come out of a project.
I have something, can I jump in actually as we're talking about this? So something that I've seen that is problematic in interdisciplinary teams is power dynamics and bringing on someone but not making them an equal partner in the work or not respecting their expertise. So I've seen sometimes where teams say we need a racial minority, or we need, you know, a person who studies cultural processes. And if you do that in your work, you really have to bring that individual or the group on as an authentic partner, not as window dressing, since that's what we just brought up. But so I've seen that challenge come up, that I think if you recognize that this is a gap in the research that could advance the science, that when you bring those folks onto the team, you really respect the knowledge that they're bringing to the team.
Can I add and just like build off of that? So like, I think the next thing to say is also that in engaging in these kinds of interdisciplinary teams in a really genuine way, you're expressing that kind of humility, or trying to, right? That Andrew mentioned and that Erica is saying needs to be there so that you can really engage with one another. And that means re-examining your own assumptions, even the very basic ones about why you study things the way you do, what counts as some construct in your world, and how somebody else could see it differently. And I think there's always a benefit to the work that goes into understanding how someone else might see it differently, even if you come to sort of, you know, reject that view or think it's not really useful to you at this time. It helps you to re-examine your own assumptions in a way that I think is very healthy, which is one of the real benefits for the individuals engaged in the work. If you're genuinely engaged with a sense of intellectual curiosity and a disposition toward kind of being willing to deconstruct the things you think you know, that is where we really start to reconcile the incompatibilities or inconsistencies across ways of seeing things, or see the synergies that could be useful. And that's where the real insights come from. So you need people who are really willing to engage in that way, and who don't just want to kind of get the project done and check off a box. It's got to be something really, really deep.
Yeah, you can't fake that. I'd also say that if you ever find a partner that you work well together, you should stick with them. Don't get divorced on that one. You know, like that'll keep going. You know, this there's a question in the Q&A that's somewhat related to this idea of bringing people together in teams that I'd like to share with y'all, and see if any of you have any advice for this. This person, it says, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a PhD candidate in an interdisciplinary program focusing on childhood trauma and resilience. My background is in nursing, and my doctoral trainings are related to developmental psychology. I definitely see the gap in my area of research in the nursing discipline, and hope to expand my research during my postdoc years. However, it's been challenging to find postdoctoral positions in my research area, as most of the jobs are designed for people from psychology or clinical psychology. There are not many nursing postdoc positions available in this area. Any advice on looking for interdisciplinary postdoc positions would be greatly appreciated. I'm sure all of you have some experience with postdocs, either as postdocs or hiring postdocs. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. And anybody who wants to weigh in, go.
I'd say search for PIs and projects and publications that really capture either a concept, a population, a skill, a discipline that you really want to go for, and then start contacting these people. Unfortunately, as we all know, the postdoc market is the most vague, crazy, unsystematic kind of thing. But I think the general theme of contacting individuals who do work that you admire and with whom you'd like to work is probably the best way to go. And then sort of, you know, I think in F32, an NRSA postdoctoral fellowship, along the lines of what this discussion just had, they really increasingly appreciate the fact that you want a training experience that's pushing you beyond your limit a little bit, and that's new, that seems to be ideal, but you need to find the right mentor. And I think along the lines of what we've been talking about, look at the mentor's work, look at how they write about the work, look about the questions, and if you think there's harmony there, then contact them. Don't just contact them because they have a skill or a tool or they're in the area that you want to do. Make sure that they're, and then I would also vet that person, talk to colleagues, talk to friends. Are they a good mentor? Are they someone? So this could go on and on and on, but I think all of these things that we talked about what it takes to do interdisciplinary work would also apply to trying to find the right postdoctoral opportunity. It's not easy. Take some time. But
is there any other advice, Erica?
I have a super practical tip that a program officer once gave to me. So one thing that you can do is look into the National Institute of Nursing Research. NIH has a nursing research institute, and I might just search what they funded to see if there are projects that are that have been recently funded that you're interested in, and reach out to those PIs. So that's just a really practical tip related to what Andrew just said.
Another possible sort of concrete tip, don't limit yourself necessarily to one person. You might be the liaison between two PIs. If those PIs are truly interested in integrating their work in this way, with you sort of as the intellectual in the middle who's pulling, that can also be a really great opportunity. I did something like that for my postdoc. So I did my doctorate in human development and psychology in the Harvard Ed School, right? So it was very educationally focusing. And then I did a postdoc with Antonio Damasio, but I also brought on a second mentor, a guy named Robert Rueda, who was in educational research. So that the work that I was doing in affective neuroscience and social neuroscience with Antonio was also being sort of discussed with someone who knew a lot about culture and educational processes and how they kind of play out in the world. So that was a way for me to make sure that I kind of stayed honest to those two fields as I went through. So you can think of things like that.
Yeah, I think you're all kind of saying you have to be a little bit more entrepreneurial, you know, or you know, a little bit, you know, the word creative comes up again too. And Jen Maggs actually weighed in on this on the Q&A, and she said her advice was to search for postdocs focused on a topic, or if NIH disease health area, for example, mental health, child maltreatment, or substance use. Many of the T32 programs are interdisciplinary, and that is true. That's actually often a requirement of funding in those things too. Okay. Let me keep talking here. I think this might be a good point. We can end with the final question, but before we get to that, I want to bring up what we were talking about earlier that I said I was going to put a pin in for a second, which is the idea of interdisciplinary, not just meaning bringing together different disciplines, but also bridging policy and practice to science, and you know, which is a different form of interdisciplinarity. And I know every single one of the people on this panel knows about this topic. So I think we would be remiss not to bring it up again. And I don't know if any of y'all have concrete advice for people about learning how to bridge that divide, not just the scientific disciplinary divide. Is there anyone that wants to weigh in, or I can pick someone?
I mean, to get divide policy and practice.
Yeah.
Is that what you asked, Rob?
Yeah. So not just bridging psychology and sociology, but bridging, you know, that interdisciplinary thing to the policy and practice world. Mary Helen, do you want to?
I started in the Zoom. I'm sorry for talking over you. It's so rude, but like what you do. The one way to start is, you know, somebody said, I can't remember who it was, you know, start trying to explain it to your grandma. You know, or your friends, you know, your friends who are not academics, right? Your kids' sports team parents, right? Like, and just be like, well, this is what I'm working on. And the questions they ask and the things that aren't clear to them are often the same things that people, you know, lay public are going to be confused in general. And so getting good at telling your story to people who will let you tell it over and over again, poor people, can actually be a good way to start. And then there's kind of no way out but a lot of practice. You get more skilled at it over time as you engage with people, so long as you're really carefully listening to the questions they're asking and the confusions or the potentially sometimes ways they misunderstand, and really actively engaging with those and not being or trying not to be, sort of hoity-toity about, well, they didn't get it, you know, but think about, well, no, how could I say it in a way that people would get it? And doing that is actually a really good intellectual exercise for yourself, because you have to distill things to the big idea. And that's sometimes a really good exercise and also really difficult.
Yes, these are all really great challenges. Okay, so let me go to the last question, and we can maybe have everybody address it too. It's also a very timely one, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly influenced adolescents' lives this year. How do you think interdisciplinary research can help promote adolescents' positive development and adjustment during the pandemic? Have your interdisciplinary teams adjusted your work during the pandemic, besides the obvious ways that we've all adjusted our work? Darlene, I'm going to ask this of you first.
Well, I think this is such a multi-layered question. being someone who works in the area of stress and trauma, this has certainly been something that has been at the forefront of, and in mental health and emotional health, been at the forefront of my mind. The challenge that I sort of see and the opportunities that I see in this is that we've learned so much even within the domain of developmental psychology and adolescent development about how adversity affects mental health functioning. And we see this played out. We even see it manifested in, reports that make it to the popular press. Where I see an opportunity here is to begin to think about what are some of the protective mechanisms that actually help adolescents to cope with extreme challenges and extreme traumas, that can buffer the impact on either physiologic systems as well as emotional and mental health. And that has sort of really come to the fore. I'll sort of also address this in terms of, as someone who studies stress regularly, I've done some, interviews with media folks, and often the question that I get there is, well, how do we cope, right? And so how do we deal with this? Not just, we don't all want to hear the doom and gloom all the time, but how do we cope? And so thinking about the ways in which these types of adversities affect our body, affect the way we process things cognitively and emotionally. A good way to sort of put this lens that we're trying to put on this in terms of how can we help positive youth development is knowing what we know. What are the points of intervention? What are the points of intervention either within the family or at the level of community or at the level of society? And those, when we begin to address those questions as interdisciplinary scientists in adolescence, those are some of the things that policymakers will look at as we think about, well, what can have policy impacts? What will they be interested in? They want to know what works. And in order to answer that question, we need to think not just about the negative impacts, but about where we can intervene.
You're muted, Rob.
Thank you. That was a really thoughtful response to that question, Darlene. We have like 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give Erica the last word. You want to weigh in here briefly on this question, Erica?
Yeah, I'll be brief. As Darlene was talking, it just made me think about like how the communities that I work with have been impacted in terms of access. So as we're thinking about points of intervention, things that policymakers are interested in and who has access, who doesn't. We do a lot of community-based work, and right now we can't offer the services, we can't be in communities in the ways that we would like to. So that's something that I've been thinking about, that I think interdisciplinary research can kind of also address how people are thinking about things like, should we take the vaccine? Is it even available to us in our community?
Thank you very much. I think that we're going to wind down now, so I'm going to throw this back to Heyman. But I just wanted to say thank you to the Interdisciplinary Committee of SRA, and I know Jennifer's on the call too, for helping to organize this. I think this was really valuable. So Heyman, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for all your time and advice and sharing your thoughts and ideas about interdisciplinary research related to both theory and practice. So thank you so much, Rob, and for awesome presenters, Andy, Erica, Dawn, and Mary Helen. I know that it's a super tricky time to share your time, specifically during this pandemic plus winter storm season. So I really appreciate your effort and time once again. And also thank you very much for attending and joining this meeting attendees. So here's one last announcement related to the logistics. So we used to have a kind of a monthly SRA webinar series, but because there will be an SRA virtual 2021 meeting in March, so the next monthly webinar is gonna be held in April instead of March. So I look forward to seeing you all at the SRA virtual 2020 meeting next month, March, and then see you all again, more monthly webinar in April. Again, thank you very much for attending this event during this difficult season, and I hope all you stay safe healthy, and warm. Thanks a lot.